The old, crumbling Victorian house at the edge of Blackwood Forest was a local legend. For decades, it had been the subject of whispered stories about strange occurrences, sudden disappearances, and sightings of shadowy figures at the windows. Despite the warnings, Sarah and her friends decided to spend the night there to investigate the truth. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a Ouija board for added thrills, they ventured into the abandoned house one cold October night. The moment they stepped through the warped front door, the air felt unnaturally heavy, as though the house itself was breathing around them. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of moonlight piercing through shattered windows. The floorboards creaked ominously under their weight, and every step seemed to echo far longer than it should. It felt as though the house was alive, waiting. As they explored, strange things began to happen. In the kitchen, Sarah found a knife lodged deep into the wooden table, its blade gleaming as if freshly polished. The stove was cold, yet the faint smell of burned meat lingered. Upstairs, in what might have once been a child's bedroom, Mark swore he heard the faint sound of a music box playing, though the room was empty. And then there were the whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. By midnight, the group gathered in the grand parlor, where a massive fireplace yawned like an abyss. They decided to use the Ouija board, laughing nervously to mask their growing unease. Sarah, Mark, Rachel, and David placed their fingers lightly on the planchette. Sarah asked the first question, "Is anyone here with us?" The planchette moved slowly, dragging itself to yes. They accused each other of pushing it, but their faces betrayed genuine fear. Rachel asked another question. "Who are you?" The board spelled out, "I see you." The room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the corners deepened, taking on impossible shapes. Suddenly, the planchette shot off the board, skidding across the room. The fireplace roared to life, its flames unnaturally blue. Then came the sound, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing from the hallway. But no one was there. David grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the doorway, only to scream and drop it. In the dim light, they all saw it, a figure standing in the hallway. Its body was impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and twisted. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where its head should have been, and it was moving toward them. The group scrambled to their feet, running in different directions in blind panic. Sarah found herself in the attic, the door slamming shut behind her. She screamed and pounded on it, but it wouldn't budge. Then she heard breathing, low, raspy, and impossibly close. Spinning around, she saw nothing but darkness, but the breathing grew louder, coming from all sides. She backed into a corner, trembling, when a pair of cold, skeletal hands grabbed her shoulders from behind. Meanwhile, Mark and Rachel were trapped in the basement, where the air was damp and stifling. The walls seemed to pulse and faint. Disembodied voices whispered their names. Rachel turned to Mark, her face pale. "It's mocking us," she said. Then, from the darkness, a hand emerged, clawed and blackened, reaching for her. Mark pulled her away and they ran, but the basement seemed to stretch endlessly. No matter how far they ran, the stairs back to the main floor never appeared. David, who had fled to the second-floor hallway, found himself in front of a mirror that hadn't been there before. In its reflection, he saw not himself, but a version of the house burning, with figures screaming and writhing in the flames. Then he saw Sarah, Mark, and Rachel's reflections too, each being dragged away by shadowy entities. The mirror cracked violently, and he felt something cold and sharp rake across his back. The night seemed endless. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. One by one, they were separated, each facing their own horrors until Sarah found herself back in the parlor, alone. The Ouija board was back on the floor, its planchette in the center. The fire had died, and the house was silent. Then the whispers started again, louder this time, overlapping into a cacophony. "Get out!" She didn't need to be told twice. Summoning every ounce of courage, she ran for the front door, which was miraculously open. The moment she crossed the threshold, the house seemed to exhale, and the oppressive weight lifted. She turned to look back, expecting to see her friends, but the house was dark and silent once more, as though it had swallowed them whole. Sarah was the only one who made it out that night. The others were never found. The townspeople said they must have run into the woods and gotten lost. But Sarah knew better. She would never forget the feeling of those skeletal hands or the whispers that still haunted her dreams. Years later, the house remains abandoned, but sometimes, if you stand outside on a quiet night, you can hear the faint sound of a music box playing, accompanied by the desperate screams of those who never escaped. The town of Ravenswood had one unwritten rule. No one visited the Hollow Church after sundown. Perched on a lonely hill, the skeletal ruins of the church seemed to loom over the town like a silent guardian or a predator. Built in the 1800s, it had burned to the ground one cold winter night, taking with it a congregation of 47 worshippers. The fire was inexplicable, as no lanterns or candles had been lit that evening. No one dared rebuild it, and the charred remains were left to rot under an unending shroud of unease. Despite the warnings, Emma, a skeptic with a taste for the macabre, decided she had to see it for herself. She was a writer, drawn to dark places for inspiration, and nothing intrigued her more than the morbid stories surrounding the church. On a frigid November night, she packed a flashlight, a notebook, and her resolve, and made her way to the Hollow Church. The path to the hill was steep and overgrown. The closer she got, the heavier the air felt, as though the ground itself was mourning something ancient and unspeakable. When she reached the ruins, the world around her seemed unnaturally silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just the oppressive stillness of a place abandoned by the living. The remains of the church were haunting. The walls were blackened and crumbling, and the stone archway that had once framed the entrance was cracked but still standing. The pews were nothing more than charred skeletons, and the altar at the far end was barely recognizable, its surface scorched and pitted. But what unnerved Emma most was the smell, an acrid stench of burned wood and something else, something foul and decayed, that lingered despite the decades. As she moved through the ruins, she began to hear faint sounds. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it soon became clear it was something else entirely. Low, guttural whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls. She stopped and strained to listen, her pulse quickening. The whispers were not in any language she could understand, but their tone was unmistakable. They were angry. Emma turned on her flashlight, sweeping the beam across the ruins. The light caught movement, just a flicker, at the edge of her vision. She spun around, but there was nothing there. She told herself it was just her imagination, but her hands trembled as she jotted notes in her notebook. Then she saw it. In the far corner of the church, where the shadows seemed unnaturally thick, a figure began to take shape. At first, it was just an outline, but as she stared, it solidified. It was tall and emaciated, its limbs impossibly long and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly like dying embers, and its mouth hung open, revealing jagged teeth. It didn't move, but Emma felt its gaze pierce through her. Frozen in terror, she couldn't look away as the figure raised one skeletal arm and pointed directly at her. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and she realized with horror that the figure wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy forms were emerging from the walls, the floor, the pews, each one grotesque and malformed, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Emma turned and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. The whispers pursued her, growing louder and more frenzied. As she passed under the crumbling archway, she felt something cold brush against her arm, and she screamed, nearly tripping on the uneven ground. She didn't stop running until she reached her car at the bottom of the hill. Slamming the door shut, she fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and she sped away, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. That night, she locked herself in her apartment and tried to convince herself it was all a hallucination. But when she looked at her arm, she saw a long, thin scratch running from her shoulder to her wrist. It wasn't there before. She never spoke of what she saw at the Hollow Church, but she stopped writing and moved away from Ravenswood soon after. Years later, the ruins remain untouched, and sometimes when the wind is right, people say they can hear whispers drifting down from the hill, accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps that don't belong to the living. In the dense wilderness of Vermont, there is a place the locals call the Silent Lake. It's not marked on any map, and those who know of it warn others to stay away. They say the lake is cursed, silent not because of peace, but because no creature dares to linger near its shores. Birds avoid flying over it, animals steer clear of the surrounding woods, and even the wind seems to lose its voice when it passes through. Sam and Claire had never heard these warnings. They were avid hikers, always searching for uncharted trails and hidden treasures in nature. When Sam stumbled upon an old, hand-drawn map in a secondhand bookstore showing a forgotten path to the lake, they couldn't resist. They packed their gear and set out early one morning, eager to see the rumored beauty of the silent lake for themselves. The hike started off normal enough, with the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant chirping of birds. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. The forest grew darker, the trees towering like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The air became heavier, carrying an earthy metallic scent that made Claire wrinkle her nose. And then the sounds of the forest began to fade, one by one, until the only sound was the soft rustle of their own footsteps. When they reached the lake, the sight was both breathtaking and unsettling. The water was unnaturally still, a perfect mirror that reflected the sky and surrounding forest with eerie precision. Not a single ripple marred its surface, and the silence was absolute, so complete that even their whispers seemed to be swallowed by the air. Setting up camp near the shore, they tried to ignore the unease creeping into their minds. They laughed nervously, cooked dinner, and shared stories to fill the oppressive quiet. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew longer, the lake seemed to come alive in its stillness. Claire noticed it first. Faint shapes moving beneath the surface, too far down to make out clearly, but unmistakably there. Fish, maybe? Sam suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Claire nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on the water. That night, they slept fitfully, disturbed by vivid, nonsensical dreams. Sam dreamt of being dragged into icy depths by unseen hands, while Claire dreamt of a woman with hollow eyes standing at the edge of the lake, her mouth opening and closing silently as if screaming without sound. They woke before dawn, disoriented and eager to leave, but when they stepped out of their tent, something was wrong. The forest around them looked different. The trees were in the same places, but their bark was darker, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The air felt colder, and the lake's surface now shimmered faintly, as though lit from below. Claire froze, pointing toward the water. Sam, look. At the center of the lake, a figure was rising slowly from the water. It was the woman from Claire's dream, her wet, tangled hair clinging to her face, her empty eyes fixed on them. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, as if pulled by invisible strings. Water poured from her open mouth, though no sound came with it. Panic gripped them. Sam grabbed Claire's arm, and they ran, abandoning their tent and supplies. But the forest seemed to conspire against them. The path they had taken the day before was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth and trees that seemed to shift as they ran. The silence was broken only by the pounding of their hearts and the faint, wet sound of footsteps behind them. Sam dared to glance back and instantly regretted it. The woman was following them, her movements unnervingly fast, her feet never quite touching the ground. Her outstretched hands clawed at the air, and her hollow eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out. Collapsing against a tree, Claire looked around frantically. The woman was gone, but the silence had returned, heavier than ever. Sam tried to speak, but no words came out. His voice was gone. Claire grabbed his hand and they stumbled onward, driven by sheer terror. Hours later, or what felt like hours, they emerged from the woods, collapsing onto the gravel of a deserted road. They were found by a passing truck driver who took them to the nearest hospital. They never spoke of what happened at the silent lake, but they never fully recovered either. Sam's voice never returned, and Claire developed an intense fear of water. She refused to even look at a puddle. Months later, an envelope arrived at Claire's door. Inside was a single photograph, a perfectly still lake, its surface shimmering faintly. At the center of the photo was the figure of the woman, her hollow eyes staring directly into the lens. It was the kind of job no one wanted, watching over the Whitaker house at night. The mansion had been abandoned for years, a hulking Gothic monstrosity with shattered windows and ivy-choked walls. But when the new owners bought it, they hired security to guard against vandals and curious teens. Ethan was desperate for cash, so he signed on despite the house's grim reputation. Locals whispered that it was haunted, that strange noises and shadowy figures had been seen inside. Ethan didn't believe in ghosts. To him, it was just another crumbling house. How hard could it be? The first night was uneventful. He walked the halls, shining his flashlight into the dark corners. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of old wood or the faint rustle of mice. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung from the high ceilings. The air smelled stale, tinged with the faint metallic scent of rust or blood. It was on the second night that things changed. Ethan was sitting in the front room, scrolling through his phone, when he heard a noise. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from upstairs. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed the grand staircase, each step creaking under his weight. The tapping grew louder as he reached the second floor, echoing down the long, dark hallway. It seemed to be coming from the farthest room. When he reached the door, he paused. The tapping had stopped. Slowly, he pushed the door open, shining his light into the room. It was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a doll, its porcelain face cracked, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead. Ethan chuckled nervously, trying to shake off the unease. "Creepy old doll," he muttered, shutting the door behind him. But as he turned to leave, he heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was coming from the room he had just left. His heart pounding, he opened the door again. The doll was still there, but now its head was tilted slightly, its lifeless eyes fixed directly on him. Ethan backed out of the room and shut the door firmly. He decided to stay downstairs for the rest of the night. On the third night, the tapping started again, louder this time, and accompanied by whispers. Ethan ignored it, refusing to go back upstairs. Instead, he stayed in the front room, gripping his flashlight tightly. Around midnight, the whispers stopped abruptly, and the house fell into an oppressive silence. Then the front door creaked open on its own. Ethan froze, his flashlight beam shaking as he pointed it toward the door. The night outside was pitch black, but the doorway was empty. He got up and shut the door, locking it. As he turned around, his flashlight flickered, and the whispers began again, closer now. They weren't coming from upstairs anymore. They were all around him. "Leave," a voice hissed, so close it felt like it was right next to his ear. Ethan spun around, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to darken, shadows crawling across the walls. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the base of the staircase. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him. The figure didn't move, but the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening chorus. Ethan bolted for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. As he fumbled with the lock, he glanced back and saw the figure was gone. But the doll was there, sitting on the staircase, its cracked face turned toward him. Its mouth, previously painted shut, was now open, and from it came a single chilling whisper, "You're next." Ethan didn't finish his shift that night. He ran to his car and drove until the house was far behind him. He quit the job the next morning and left town soon after. The Whitaker house still stands, and it's still empty. The new owners never managed to renovate it, and no one else has taken the job. But sometimes, late at night, passersby swear they see a light in the upstairs window and hear faint, rhythmic tapping, as if someone or something is waiting. The old highway that cut through the Nevada desert was infamous among truckers and night travelers. Locals called it Dead Man's Stretch, a desolate road where radios lost their signal, cell phones went dead, and eerie figures were often seen walking along the shoulder. But what made it truly terrifying were the disappearances, drivers who took the route and were never seen again. Alex didn't believe in urban legends. A long-haul trucker with years of experience, he prided himself on being unshakable. So when his dispatcher gave him a late-night delivery that required taking the infamous road, Alex shrugged it off and set out without hesitation. The desert night was pitch black, with only his truck's headlights cutting through the void. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt surrounded by flat, empty nothingness. Even the stars seemed dimmer here, their light swallowed by the oppressive darkness. For the first hour, everything was fine. The hum of the engine and the soft whir of the tires on the pavement kept Alex grounded. But then, his radio began to crackle with static. He fiddled with the dial, but every station was dead. Even his GPS screen flickered and froze, leaving him with nothing but the barren road and his own thoughts. That was when he saw her. A figure appeared in the distance, standing on the side of the road. As Alex drew closer, the figure became clearer. A woman in a tattered white dress, her long dark hair hanging in a matted curtain around her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, her head bowed. Alex slowed down, instinctively wary. As his truck passed her, she lifted her head, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the dark, but her eyes were black, completely black, like twin voids. Alex's breath caught in his throat, and he hit the gas, speeding away. In his rearview mirror, the woman remained standing there, unmoving, until she disappeared into the darkness. Shaking his head, Alex muttered to himself, "Just a trick of the light, nothing more." But 10 minutes later, he saw her again. This time, she was standing in the middle of the road, forcing him to slam on the brakes. His tires screeched, and the truck shuddered to a stop mere feet from her. His heart pounded as he gripped the wheel, staring at the woman through the windshield. She didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. "Get out of the way!" Alex shouted, his voice trembling. The woman's lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile, and she took a step toward the truck. Her movements were jerky, almost puppet-like. Without thinking, Alex threw the truck into reverse, backing up as fast as he could before swerving around her and speeding off down the highway. The adrenaline didn't fade. He kept checking his mirrors, expecting to see her again. And then, with a cold, sinking dread, he realized he wasn't alone. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement in the passenger seat. Turning his head slowly, he saw her sitting there, her black eyes locked on him, her face unnervingly close. Her mouth opened, and a low, guttural whisper filled the cab, though her lips didn't move. "You shouldn't have come here." Alex screamed, jerking the wheel and causing the truck to swerve violently. When he looked back, she was gone, but the truck's cabin felt colder, as if something had been drained from the air itself. The whisper, though, still echoed faintly in his ears. Determined to get off the highway, Alex pressed the pedal to the floor, his hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. But no matter how far he drove, the road stretched on endlessly with no exits, no mile markers, and no sign of civilization. It was as if he were trapped in a loop, driving the same stretch of road over and over. And then the lights went out. The truck's headlights flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. The engine sputtered and stalled, leaving him stranded in silence. He fumbled for his flashlight, his breath coming in shallow gasps, and stepped out of the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The desert around him was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no insects, just an oppressive stillness. Then, in the distance, he saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, dozens of them. They walked slowly toward him, their forms shadowy and indistinct, but their eyes glowed faintly like dying embers. Alex backed away, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figures moved closer, surrounding him, their whispers rising in a cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing he saw before the flashlight flickered and died was the woman in the white dress standing at the center of the crowd, her black eyes filled with something ancient and hungry. Alex's truck was found days later, abandoned on the side of the highway. The cab was empty, the engine dead, and his belongings untouched. Of Alex, there was no sign. Truckers still avoid Deadman Stretch, and those who do take it at night often speak of strange figures and chilling whispers. Some say Alex is still out there, lost in the endless loop of that cursed road, forever driving toward a destination he'll never reach. Deep in the woods of northern Maine, there was a cabin known as the Whistler's Retreat. It had been abandoned for decades, but locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning anyone who ventured into the forest to stay away. The story went that anyone who spent the night there would hear the Whistler, a ghostly presence whose haunting tune would drive them mad. Mia, an amateur photographer, had no patience for ghost stories. She was more interested in capturing the beauty of forgotten places, and the Whistler's Retreat seemed like the perfect subject. She loaded her camera gear, packed a few essentials, and set out on the long hike to the cabin. The air was crisp, and the dense canopy of trees filtered the sunlight into dappled patches. It felt like an adventure, and she laughed at the thought of being scared by an old legend. She reached the cabin by late afternoon. It was smaller than she expected, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. The windows were shattered, and the door hung slightly ajar. But it had an eerie charm that made it perfect for her project. Mia spent hours photographing the exterior, capturing the way the light played on the cracked wood and the overgrown surroundings. As night fell, she decided to stay, eager to get some atmospheric shots in the morning. Inside, the cabin was as decrepit as the outside suggested. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and the air was damp and musty. There was no electricity, so Mia set up her lantern and unrolled her sleeping bag in the main room. She ate a quick meal and tried to relax, telling herself it was just like any other solo trip. But as the hours crept by, the silence of the woods became oppressive. The usual sounds of the night, crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves, were absent, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Mia felt uneasy, but she told herself it was just her imagination. Then she heard it, a faint whistle, carried on the breeze, drifting through the broken windows. It was a simple tune, slow and melancholy, the kind of melody that lingered in your mind even after it stopped. Mia froze, her heart pounding. She told herself it was the wind, or maybe some hiker passing by. But the whistle grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was coming from just outside the cabin. Gripping her flashlight, Mia crept to the door and shone the beam into the darkness. The woods were empty. No movement, no figures, just the dense tangle of trees. She stepped outside, her breath visible in the cold air. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The whistle stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mia backed into the cabin, locking the door even though it wouldn't keep anyone out. She sat in her sleeping bag, clutching her flashlight and staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed. Just as she began to convince herself it was over, the whistle started again. This time, it was inside the cabin. The melody was sharper now, the notes twisting unnaturally like a song played backward. Mia spun around, shining her flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the small space until it felt like the walls were vibrating. And then she saw them. In the far corner of the room, a pair of glowing eyes blinked open, staring directly at her. They were too high to belong to a person, and as her flashlight beam swept upward, she saw a tall, thin figure standing in the shadows. Its face was gaunt, its mouth unnaturally wide, and from its lips came the whistle, the sound rising and falling in a pattern that made her stomach churn. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Mia scrambled backward, knocking over her lantern, plunging the room into near-total darkness. She fumbled for her flashlight, her fingers trembling, and when she turned it back on, the figure was gone. But the whistle remained. It was louder now, deafening, as if the sound itself was trying to pull her apart. Mia screamed, covering her ears, but it didn't help. The walls of the cabin began to shake, the wood groaning under an unseen pressure. Desperate, she grabbed her camera and ran, bursting out of the cabin and into the woods. The whistling followed her, weaving through the trees, never fading no matter how far she ran. She tripped and fell, the camera slipping from her hands, but she didn't stop. She didn't dare look back. When she finally reached the main road, the sound was gone. The forest was silent once more, and the cabin was nowhere in sight. Mia never returned to the Whistler's retreat, and she refused to speak of what happened that night. But weeks later, when she developed the photos she'd taken, one image stood out. A shot of the cabin just before sunset. In the window, barely visible, was the outline of a tall, thin figure, its hollow eyes staring straight at the camera. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there was a trail known as the Devil's Hollow. It wasn't marked on any official maps, and most hikers avoided it due to the stories that surrounded it. Locals claimed the trail was cursed, haunted by something ancient and malevolent. They spoke of strange lights, whispers in the trees, and people who entered the hollow but never returned. Lena had heard the stories but didn't believe them. She was a seasoned backpacker, drawn to the thrill of exploring places few dared to venture. When she found the trailhead, hidden behind a cluster of dense pines, she felt a spark of excitement. The weather was perfect, the forest alive with the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. It felt like any other hike. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding through dense woods. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden patches. But as Lena ventured deeper, the atmosphere began to shift. The trees grew taller, their twisted branches forming a near impenetrable ceiling. The birdsong faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if she were walking into a place the world had forgotten. Then came the markers. At first they were subtle, piles of rocks arranged in strange, spiral patterns along the side of the trail. Then she started seeing carvings on the trees, symbols she didn't recognize, etched deep into the bark. They were crude but deliberate, and something about them made her skin crawl. Lena told herself it was just the work of pranksters, or perhaps an old tradition she didn't understand. She pressed on, refusing to let fear take root. But as the hours passed, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Shadows seemed to move at the edges of her vision, and she began to hear faint whispers, too soft to make out, but constant, like a voice carried on the wind. By the time she reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to set. The open space should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The clearing was dominated by a massive tree, its trunk gnarled and blackened as if struck by lightning. Around its base were more of the strange symbols, drawn in what looked like ash. In the center of the clearing was a stone circle, and inside it lay a small wooden box, its surface darkened by age and rot. Something about the box pulled at her curiosity. Against her better judgment, Lena stepped into the circle and reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed the wood, the forest seemed to exhale. A low, guttural sound echoed through the clearing, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. She opened the box. Inside was a single object, a withered, human-like finger, its nail long and yellowed. Lena recoiled, dropping the box. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the clearing into silence. But then the air grew colder, and a deep, resonant voice spoke, its words reverberating in her chest. "You were warned." Lena spun around, but no one was there. The shadows around the tree seemed to grow darker, coalescing into a figure that stepped forward. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long and its face obscured by shadow. Its eyes, two pinpricks of white light, burned into her. The figure raised a hand, and the whispers returned, now a deafening roar. Lena ran. She didn't care about the trail, didn't care where she was going. She just needed to get away. The forest seemed alive, the branches clawing at her clothes, the roots tangling her feet. The whispers followed her, growing louder with every step until it felt like they were inside her head. When she finally stumbled out of the woods and onto a gravel road, the noise stopped. The forest behind her was still, the trailhead nowhere in sight. She collapsed, gasping for breath, her heart hammering in her chest. A passing driver found her hours later and took her to the nearest town. She tried to explain what had happened, but her words came out jumbled and incoherent. The locals, hearing where she had been, only shook their heads. "No one goes to Devil's Hollow," one of them said. "Not if they want to come back whole." Lena left town the next day, vowing never to return, but the nightmares followed her. Every night, she dreamed of the clearing, the tree, and the box. And in the darkest hours of the night, she could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, as if the hollow was calling her back. There's a small, forgotten cemetery tucked deep in the woods of rural Pennsylvania. Known by locals as Black Hollow Graveyard, it's been abandoned for over a century. The gravestones are weathered and crooked, some toppled and half buried by moss and roots. Most people avoid it, claiming the place is cursed. They speak of strange lights, shadowy figures, and a suffocating sense of dread that lingers long after you leave. Marissa and her two friends, Jake and Elise, had heard the stories growing up. Now in their 20s and eager for a thrill, they decided to visit the cemetery on Halloween night. Jake, ever the skeptic, brought a flashlight and a flask of whiskey, laughing off the warnings as old wives' tales. Elise was more nervous, but didn't want to be the one to chicken out. Marissa, always up for an adventure, led the way. The hike to Black Hollow was uneventful at first. The air was crisp, and the moon hung low, casting silver light through the bare branches. But as they approached the cemetery, the atmosphere changed. The woods grew unnaturally quiet, no rustling leaves, no distant hoot of an owl. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the frosty ground. When they reached the cemetery gates, rusted iron barely clinging to stone pillars, they stopped. The air felt heavy, and the shadows between the graves seemed darker than they should be. Jake, trying to lighten the mood, took a swig from his flask and pushed the gate open with a creak that echoed into the silence. "Come on," he said, waving them in. "It's just a bunch of rocks." They wandered among the graves, reading the faded inscriptions. Most were from the late 1800s, the names and dates barely legible. Elise lingered by a gravestone with a cracked angel atop it, her unease growing. "We should go," she whispered. "This place feels wrong." "Don't be scared," Jake teased, shining his flashlight around. "See? No ghosts, no monsters, just old stones." As he spoke, the beam of his flashlight flickered and died. Jake smacked it against his hand, but it wouldn't turn back on. "Cheap batteries," he muttered. Marissa pulled out her own flashlight, but it too flickered and went out. Then came the sound. A low, mournful hum, like the distant wail of wind through a hollow pipe. But there was no wind. The air was still and cold. The sound grew louder, reverberating through the cemetery. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting. "Who's there?" Marissa called, her voice trembling. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep silence that pressed against their ears. And then, in the corner of the cemetery, a light appeared. It was faint at first, a soft bluish glow hovering near the ground, but it grew brighter, illuminating the outline of a figure. The figure was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a hood. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, its glowing form casting unnatural shadows across the graves. The friends froze, their breath visible in the icy air. "Let's go," Elise whispered, tugging on Marissa's sleeve. But when they turned toward the gate, they saw another figure standing there, blocking their path. This one was closer, its features clearer, a hollow face with empty, staring eyes and a gaping mouth that seemed to drip darkness. The chanting began again, louder now, coming from all around them. More figures appeared, emerging from the shadows, their glowing forms flickering like dying flames. Panicking, Jake bolted toward the woods. "Run!" he shouted. Marissa and Elise followed, their hearts pounding as they weaved through the trees. The chanting didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder, closer, as if the figures were following them. The woods seemed to twist and stretch, the path back to the car impossibly long. Finally, they burst out onto the dirt road where their car was parked. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and they piled in, locking the doors. As the engine roared to life, Marissa glanced back toward the woods. For a brief moment, she saw them, the glowing figures standing at the edge of the trees, their hollow eyes watching. Then the car sped away, leaving the cemetery and its horrors behind. The three friends didn't speak of that night for months, but none of them were the same. Elise moved out of town entirely, unable to bear living near the woods. Jake, once the biggest skeptic, became withdrawn and paranoid. Marissa tried to move on, but the nightmares wouldn't stop, dreams of chanting voices and glowing eyes. A year later, on Halloween night, Marissa received a text from Jake. It was short, just 2 words, "They're back." When she tried to call him, there was no answer. Jake was never seen again. And now, every Halloween, locals say the lights in Black Hollow Graveyard are brighter, the chanting louder, as if something is growing stronger. In a quiet coastal town in Oregon, there was an old lighthouse, perched on the cliffs overlooking the sea. It hadn't been operational in decades, but the locals still avoided it, claiming it was cursed. They whispered about the keeper's shadow, a figure that was said to haunt the tower. The story went that the last lighthouse keeper, a man named Edward Gray, had gone mad during a violent storm and thrown himself into the sea. Since then, strange things happened to anyone who dared to enter the lighthouse after dark. Samantha had just moved to the town, seeking solitude after a painful breakup. She wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, and the lighthouse intrigued her. She was an amateur historian and thought the site might be a perfect project for her blog. Ignoring the warnings of her new neighbors, she packed her camera and notebook and decided to visit the lighthouse on a blustery October evening. The trail to the lighthouse was steep and overgrown, the wind howling through the cliffs. By the time she reached the tower, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky shore. The lighthouse loomed above her, its paint peeling and its windows broken, but it still had a rugged beauty that drew her in. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, Samantha stepped inside. The air was damp and carried the faint smell of salt and decay. The interior was as derelict as she expected, rusted machinery, broken furniture, and the remnants of a life long abandoned. She set to work photographing the space, her footsteps echoing in the hollow chamber. As she climbed the spiral staircase to the top, a strange sensation settled over her. The air grew colder with every step, and she felt an inexplicable heaviness, as though something unseen was pressing down on her. She told herself it was just the old building playing tricks on her senses. When she reached the lantern room, the view took her breath away. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, the waves crashing against the cliffs far below. She took out her camera, snapping pictures of the sunset. But when she looked at the photos, something wasn't right. In every frame, there was a faint silhouette, a tall, dark figure standing in the corner of the room. Her heart raced as she spun around, but the room was empty. The wind whistled through the broken glass, and for a moment she thought she could hear something else, a low, rasping voice whispering her name. "Samantha?" She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The whisper came again, louder this time. It seemed to come from the shadows themselves, curling around her like smoke. "Why did you come?" The temperature plummeted, and frost began to form on the cracked windows. Samantha backed toward the staircase, her camera dangling from her neck. As she descended, the shadows seemed to move, pooling and shifting along the walls. She could feel something following her, its presence oppressive and unrelenting. When she reached the bottom, she bolted for the door. But before she could reach it, the heavy iron machinery in the corner groaned to life. The lighthouse's lens, long shattered and broken, began to spin, casting beams of pale, unnatural light. The sound of grinding gears filled the air, drowning out her panicked breaths. And then she saw him. Standing in the doorway was a man in a tattered coat, his face obscured by shadow. His eyes glowed faintly like embers, and his head tilted unnaturally as he stared at her. Samantha stumbled backward, tripping over a rusted lantern. The figure didn't move but raised an arm, pointing toward her with a long, skeletal finger. The whisper became a scream, a deafening roar that seemed to come from every direction. Samantha clamped her hands over her ears and ran, bursting through the doorway and into the night. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her lungs burning and her heart pounding. When she looked back, the lighthouse was dark again, its silhouette against the sky as lifeless as it had been for decades. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, even as she sped away. That night, Samantha couldn't sleep. Her dreams were filled with images of the lighthouse and the shadowy figure. When she finally worked up the courage to review the photos she'd taken, her blood ran cold. In every image, the figure was there, standing closer each time, its glowing eyes locked on her. Samantha left the town the next morning, abandoning her project and vowing never to return. But even miles away, she couldn't escape the feeling that the keeper's shadow had followed her. And on stormy nights, when the wind howled, she swore she could still hear it, whispering her name. In the heart of the Midwest, there was a stretch of highway known as Whispering Mile. Drivers avoided it at night, claiming they heard voices when they passed through, a faint murmur that grew louder the longer you stayed. The stories varied. Some said it was the ghosts of a family killed in a car crash. Others swore it was the work of something darker, older. But no one lingered on that road after sunset. Mark was a long-haul trucker who prided himself on not believing in ghost stories. He'd driven through storms, snow, and desolate backroads without so much as a second thought. So when his dispatcher gave him a route that crossed Whispering Mile, he shrugged it off. It was just another road, and he wasn't about to let superstitions slow him down. The drive started like any other. The night was clear, the moon casting a pale glow over the flat landscape. The highway was deserted, stretching endlessly in both directions. Mark sipped his coffee and hummed along to the radio, his headlights cutting through the darkness. Then he reached the mile. The first sign was subtle. The radio cut out, replaced by a soft static. Mark frowned, fiddling with the dial, but no station would come through. The silence in the cab felt heavier now, the hum of the engine and the crunch of the tires against the road suddenly louder. That's when he heard it, a whisper, faint and fleeting, like a voice carried on the wind. He glanced in the mirrors but saw nothing except the empty road behind him. Shaking his head, he muttered, "Tired, that's all." He turned up the heater, trying to push away the chill creeping into the cab. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't one voice, it was many, overlapping and weaving together into an incoherent murmur. Mark's hands tightened on the wheel. Just the wind, he told himself. But the voices grew louder, and no amount of rationalizing could explain the words he began to make out. "Turn around. You shouldn't be here. It's too late." Mark's pulse quickened as he scanned the road ahead. That's when he saw the figure. A woman, standing in the middle of the highway. She was wearing a white dress that fluttered in the non-existent wind, her hair hanging in dark strands over her face. Mark slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just feet away from her. He leaned out of the window, his voice shaky. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman didn't move. Cursing under his breath, Mark grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The air was unnaturally cold, and the silence was so profound it pressed against his ears. "Miss?" he called, approaching her cautiously. "Do you need help?" As he drew closer, he realized something was wrong. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She hovered inches above the asphalt, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him, and Mark realized they weren't coming from her. They were coming from everywhere. The woman's head snapped toward him, and he saw her face, pale, hollow-eyed, and stretched into a too-wide grin that didn't reach her eyes. Mark stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking in his hands. Before he could react, she vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. But the whispers remained, now deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to claw at his mind. He ran back to his truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. The engine roared to life, and he floored the accelerator, desperate to get away. As he sped down the highway, the voices didn't fade. They grew sharper, closer, as if they were inside the cab with him. His rearview mirror caught movement, and his blood turned to ice. In the sleeper compartment behind him, the woman sat cross-legged, her empty eyes staring at him through the mirror. Mark screamed, swerving wildly, but when he turned around, the compartment was empty. The truck shuddered, lights flickering as the voices reached a fever pitch, and then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. The truck coasted to a stop at the end of the mile. The air was warm again, the night calm. Mark sat frozen in his seat, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't dare look back. He didn't even stop to check the truck for damage. He just drove, putting as much distance as he could between himself and Whispering Mile. Mark quit trucking after that night. He refused to explain why, brushing off questions with a strained smile. But sometimes late at night, he swore he could still hear the whispers, soft, insistent, and always calling his name.